Hey, this is Dominic, and this is your home for the cutting-edge conversations on optimizing your personal performance, lighting up your sex life, and living a purpose-driven life of your own design.
These are the topics that Dominic and I have both struggled with in our own lives and still don't always get right. This is Brian. Welcome to the Great Man Podcast.
You know, one thing that I've learned as I started playing bigger games in my life is that the failures got bigger. I guess that would only make sense, right? But as I continued to fail, and I still continue to fail gloriously to this day, I've also learned to fear failure less. Now that means I go after 100% of what I want more and more often. And that's not something I could have said for the majority of my life. I'd go after 80% of what I wanted because I knew I could get it, but to go after 100% and to risk failure, it's just easier to pull back and stand on the sidelines of the things that I really wanted. But when I go after 100% of what I want, the victories get bigger. Now, in our masterminds, I see men at much earlier stages of their inner work journey, and fear of failure is still a major inhibitor for men going after 100% of what they want in their life. Now, one of the most common themes among men who join our masterminds is this experience of feeling that life is good, but not great, right? They have this deeper sense of knowing that they're standing on the sidelines of the real games they want to be playing, but are too afraid of the consequences of failing in their pursuit. Can you relate to that on some level? So in this episode, Brian and I are going to take a deeper dive into the fear forces that keep you stuck and paralyzed from going after 100% of what you truly want. We're going to share 4 of our greatest life lessons from failing and failing big. We're also going to talk about what the Stoics, Napoleon Hill, and of course, what Walter White have to say about failure. I'm going to share why an ego shattered by failure is a beautifully liberating moment, and why having a brotherhood allows you to fail bigger and ultimately win bigger. So enjoy this conversation on failure, 4 of life's greatest lessons from getting knocked down hard. All right, buddy, I'm about to read you one of the most powerful, potent, and well-known written pieces on courage in the history of humanity. And it comes from your boy, Theodore Roosevelt. And this is called The Man in the Arena. It is not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles or where the doer of good deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs, who comes short again and again, because there is no effort without error and shortcoming, but who does actually strive to do the deeds, who knows great enthusiasms, the great devotions, who spends himself in a worthy cause, who at the best knows, in the end, the triumph of high achievement, and who at the worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly, so that his place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who neither know victory nor defeat.
Chills. That just gives me chills, man. Dom, I was listening to our podcast that we recently released on the victim versus victor mindset. And while I don't catch every podcast that we do. I was on a run listening to that one because I've been feeling in this place of feeling stuck, feeling like I'm on the sideline. And I mentioned something in that podcast about, we all know those people that have that victim mentality. They have this lens of the world that the world's out to get them. And as I was listening to that podcast, I realized that I've been there, and not just like been there, but I'm currently there.
Yeah.
I was like, wow, what a great time to take some of our own medicine. And as you know, I run a COVID testing business, right? We run a technology platform that allows other groups to test and keep track of status. And as we all know, and hopefully this continues to be the trend, that COVID is starting to go away. And I've noticed myself as I focus more just on operations and seeing those come down a little bit, like I haven't started to turn my attention towards the next thing. And I felt like my life has been like the world is moving really fast The world's doing really cool things, and I'm just like being left behind. I started to notice that I started to become more critical. And gosh, I think Theodore Roosevelt starts with that. It's not to the critic.
Right. Yeah, not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles or where the doer of deeds could have done them better.
Yeah. Yeah. So I started realizing that, like, man, I'm becoming more of a critic than a creator. And then I even had a version of that, which isn't a critic, but a fan. And I just became a fan of certain things. Like, oh, I really like this. I really like that. And that's great. I love that. That's enjoyable in moments. But when it's all about like either becoming a critic or a fan and not a creator, for me, I felt really slow. And so I had to do a little bit of a deeper dive on like, why am I there? Like, what's going on, Brian?
Yeah. And I respect you bringing this forward. One of the things that Napoleon Hill says in Outwitting the Devil is one of the telltale signs of drift is when you are publicly or privately criticizing someone else. Because when you are intentional and living in lockstep with your purpose, you don't have time to be thinking about or criticizing other people. You're the one who's in the arena. You're battling that dragon, right? Like you don't have time to stop and criticize what someone's wearing or what they're doing. You know, the reason why we're having this conversation is because there are men who are listening who want something in their lives and they're on the sidelines of their life in that particular space. Whether it's with purpose, career, making money, with romance, physical well-being, you name it. Everyone is on the sidelines of their life in some area. And it's so important for us to talk about failure in these moments where we're on the sideline to remind ourselves the lessons that we're learning, that we've learned from failure and how we've come back better. But before we get there, sometimes it's helpful to explore some of the introspection that you've already done around, but there's this fear, right, that stands between me and stepping out into that arena. And that fear is oftentimes quite nebulous. Like we feel the fear, but we don't know exactly what that fear is. We can't quite pinpoint it until we've done some mindful reflection. And you've done that, right? And you kind of came up with 3 very specific fears once you had a chance to stop and reflect. Because we were talking about this yesterday. You had nebulous fears. You didn't know what they were. This morning, you came back with a list of here's what they are. This is what's keeping me on the sideline. So why don't you talk about what those 3 fears are? Because I know there's men who are listening who are like, I can relate.
Yeah, and I could only bring this up because I was sitting on the sideline for so long. I was there for months. And I finally got really tired of being that asshole critic, really tired of not doing, not like just having to watch. And I started to ask myself, like, well, what is it, man? Like, what are you afraid of? I've failed. I failed miserably. I've failed multiple times. We've talked about this on the podcast before, whether it's been in businesses or relationships. But when I think about that fear that was paralyzing me, that was keeping me on the sidelines, that was keeping me safe, one was a fear that I'm going to lose money. Like if I make big bets and I change what I'm doing now, which is working, then I'm going to lose money like I did before. That was one like really major thing. It's like, hey, money's coming in now. We're doing okay. Like why upset the apple cart right now? So that's one. The second one is that I'll lose relationships. So whether that's a co-founder or a friend or somebody in that area, it's like, hey, like, I'm good. I'm not upsetting anybody right now. But if I make some big moves, I might piss some people off when I go after something that I want that's different than what I'm doing right now.
An addendum to what you just said is I might lose the respect of friends, right? So like you're talking about losing potential relationships like co-founders, et cetera. But I think that one of the big fears that a lot of us have is if I fail publicly, I'm going to lose the respect of certain people in my life or maybe my following on social media or some of the people that I'm in business with, because I've had this track record of continued success. So losing the respect of some of the people in your life, I think is a corollary to what you just shared.
Right. I think those are 2 sides of the same coin because here's the thing. When you talk about respect, if I don't do anything, if I don't put anything out there, if I stay on the sideline, people may wonder, and I wonder what he's up to. Like, I become irrelevant. And irrelevance is actually feels safer than failure.
Yep.
And so when I looked at that, I was like, oh man. I was having a conversation with a guy earlier this week, and he's being sued by a business partner. And I looked at him like, dude, that's awesome. He's like, what is wrong with you? Why would you say that's awesome? Like, what did you do? Like, what game were you
must have
playing?
done something really interesting.
Like, what arena were you in? Were you playing in? right? That somebody had to sue you because of something that you did. And he got it at the end. Because I was like, man, like nobody could sue me for anything right now because I'm not doing anything. just sitting here and pressing buttons, right? And so while that does seem a little bit crazy, like wow, he's doing things, he's making big changes. So that was one of the the weird reactions that I've had in the last couple of weeks to an experience that told me time to get off the sidelines.
Yeah. And what was the third fear?
Those two are hand in hand. So it was I would lose a friend or a co-founder or somebody that's like intimately involved with what I'm doing. So I've made some sort of commitment associated with this business. But if I'm going to move on, then we need to change that commitment. I need to have that conversation. So that could upset people. The other one was the respect that you were talking about.
Yeah. Okay. Got it. One of the things I did before we started recording today was I went out and I searched some of the best quotes on fear, failure and fear. And of course, we have our boy, Napoleon Hill. We've got some stuff from the Stoics. And by the way, when it comes to Stoics, and I respect Stoicism, there are guys who just have get a raging hard on for Stoicism. It's kind of strange when you talk about Stoics, people get oh, this is so excited. It's almost like someone who gets excited about astrology, and I'm not making fun of Stoicism or astrology, but people get really excited about it.
It sounds like you're definitely making fun of both of them. Yeah.
Maybe I'm poking fun.
Don't poke the Stoic.
I'm about to poke the Stoics, but you know what I'm talking about, right? Some of these guys get really, really excited about Stoicism and will bend your ear. But to placate our Stoic friends, Seneca said, "We suffer more in our imagination than we do in reality." This is a powerful one, right? We suffer more in our imagination than we do in our reality. And, you talk about the months of sitting on the sidelines and criticizing others. It also opens up a quote from the teacher that I always cite on this podcast is my boy, Walter White from Breaking Bad. And he has this great quote about fear that embodies what Seneca was just talking about. And Walter White is in chemotherapy treatment because he's had a recent cancer diagnosis. And he's talking to a man who had just been diagnosed with cancer. And here's what Walter White had to say. "I've spent my whole life scared, frightened of things that could happen. Might happen, might not happen. 50 years I've spent like that, finding myself awake at 3 a.m. But you know what? Ever since my diagnosis, I sleep just fine. I came to realize it's that fear is the worst of it. That's the real enemy. So get up, get out in the real world, and you kick that bastard as hard as you can right in the teeth." And I love that quote because it's true. You take that plus Seneca's, "We suffer more in our imagination than in reality." It's the fear that's paralyzing us. I mean, you and I have both failed many times in our lives, and we're going to talk about some of the key learnings the lessons that we've learned from that. When we're actually in those moments of failure, it's never quite as devastating as I've made it out of my mind to be. I don't feel as impotent as I do when I'm just not going for it. Like you were saying, on some level, it feels like irrelevance is safer than failure, but it's not. Relevance is actually one of my deepest fears. It's just that, what that is? That leads you to the definition of hell, right? The end of your life, the man that you became meets the man that you could have become. And the man that you became is the one who sat on the sidelines, protecting, trying to be predictable, comfort, safety, versus getting in the fucking arena, getting sweaty, getting bloody, getting knocked down. That's the only way your great man emerges.
Yeah, what's worse than somebody being like, "I don't really remember that person. I don't really."
Yeah, I know.
Not much.
I know.
Didn't really do anything.
I don't remember. Yeah, forget it, man. So I think this is a good place to get into the first lesson that you learned, which, when you said this to me, I'm like, this needs to be the one that kicks it off. So what's the first lesson that you learned?
Yeah, well, I'm going to go back really quick to the fears, right? I'm going to lose money. I'm going to lose colleagues. I'm going to lose respect, right? All three of those have happened to me. I didn't make that up in my mind. Those things literally happened to me. I'm afraid of them happening again. But what I learned from going through that is I can come back. And I've come back in all of those areas. So when I'm facing this sideline again and wanting to play it safe, I can look at this and say yes, those are fears. Those are there. I have experienced that before, but I've also come back. I've also given it a second chance and a third chance and a fourth chance. So take some swings, dude.
Yeah. And Napoleon Hill along those lines said that every adversity, every failure, every heartbreak carries with it the seed of an equal or greater benefit. I'll read it again because sometimes it's helpful to hear it twice when you're listening. Every adversity, every failure, every heartbreak carries with it the seed of an equal or greater benefit. To be very specific in your life, Bri, the first startup that you had with Beam, the sexual health company, you took a big swing, right? You drained like a lot of your bank account and your savings from over a decade in consulting to put it behind this sexual health company. You won awards for the sexual health company, but in the end, financially, the business couldn't find its footing and you had to shut it down. It was pretty public because, you were out there. We'd all seen it. There were many of us who were supporting you. And I know that you went through dark nights of the soul, losing money. You lost the relationship with your co-founder. So, you're talking about real life things, but you learned from that. You hit your bottom inside of our mastermind. I remember you talking about that. I feel like a failure. You even talked about it on the podcast about 2 years ago. And then you came up with this company, the COVID testing company, using a lot of the technology that had been built during that first go round, which wasn't a complete failure because you took that technology, you were quick to be able to jump on the COVID testing thing when the world needed it. And you were able to come up with some pretty big clients, marquee names, and very successful run over the last 2+ years.
Yeah. And it was actually the experiences and the relationships I had developed during that, quote, failure experience that allowed me to do the next thing. But I can tell you after being on the sideline for several months now, I'm not really gaining much experience. I'm not really meeting new people. That at times can make me feel isolated and alone.
Yeah. And I think this is actually a good segue into one of the lessons that I've learned, because you were talking about what you were able to carry forward from the previous experience. And one of the lessons that I've learned about failure is failure will either strengthen or shatter your ego. Failure will either strengthen or shatter your ego. And which one happens depends on whether you believe in the fixed or growth mindset of things, right? And fixed or growth mindset comes from Carol Dweck's book, Mindset. And the people who fall into the fixed category of mindset is we're all born into this world having a specific set of skills, and you could kind of maybe incrementally change, but you're pretty much kind of a finished product, especially as you get older and you go through life. And so when you experience failure, it's kind of oh, I'm not meant to do this. I'm not meant to be a successful entrepreneur. You just kind of boom, write it off. The growth mindset is I'm constantly learning and developing. I'm growing. And I think the essence of that is something else that I had written down when I was journaling this morning was this mindset of no matter what happens in life, I'm better for having had the experience. I think that's the ultimate of growth mindset. No matter what happens in life, I'm better for having had the experience. When we talk about ego is often, I think, pigeonholed when we say that guy's got a big ego. What we're typically saying is that person's arrogant. He thinks a lot of himself, right? Braggadocious. But we all have tremendous big egos. Ego is born out of necessity to protect yourself. So the person who's actually not saying a damn thing because he's too afraid of being criticized has just as big of an ego as the guy who's boasting. It's just showing up differently, right? So we all have incredible egos. The guy who wants to build the business but is afraid of criticism or afraid of losing money like you're talking about, who never gets off the sideline, tremendous ego. And the only reason why I'm speaking this passionately about it is because my ego was so fucking big that God had to give me both an addiction and a chronic illness and Lyme disease to help me jackhammer through this ego and start to shed it so that I can get rid of the bullshit and the fears that are inside and actually learn how to roll with life a little bit.
Are we done now? Is that it? Have you completely shattered your ego, or is there some other disaster heading your way?
No, my God, man. There's some other asteroid on its way in. I'm sure some woman's going to come in and break my heart, or I don't know, financial ruin is on its way. But you and I love Michael Singer's teachings so much, right? And everything he talks about is that layer of surrender. Can you get to that next layer of letting go of the things that you desire and crave and you're attached to, and letting go of your fear of, I can't have that happen, Because once those two things fade away, then no matter what life throws at you, you're able to dance with it. And Ram Dass, who's a great spiritual teacher that I know Michael Singer looked up to, right? Like Ram Dass was kind of doing his thing when Michael Singer was starting to learn. Ram Dass was this great spiritual teacher for decades. And later on in life, he suffered a stroke that paralyzed him, put him in a wheelchair. People had to bathe him, clean him, colostomy bag, everything, could barely speak. And at first, it was for him like one of the most devastating things that he had experienced. It almost actually called him to question his entire faith and everything he taught. But what he ended up seeing was that one more layer of ego just needed to be bulldozed through and let go of. The need to have a fully functioning physical body, the need to be able to, look a certain way or to get about his life in a certain way, and had to surrender to other people taking care of him. And he ends up talking about at the end of his life that was one of the greatest gifts he had ever experienced. To put a capstone on this and see what you have to say about it, Bri, my insight is failure will either strengthen your ego, and the strengthening is like you build up more fear, you build up more armor because like you don't know how to deal with it, or it will shatter your ego. And the shattering of the ego, while painful, can actually lead to one of the most profound deepening moments in your life.
Yeah, it's a matter of perspective. And going back to that podcast that we recently released on how are we allowing ourselves to experience like what we've gone through? Is it as a victim, right? As this is really happening to me? Or is it that growth mindset where Ram Dass got? Is it no, like I can be a victor in this? And I love that. I think with every one of these, we have that choice. We can either choose to sit on the sidelines, or we can come back and understand how life is now. So I'm going to give you the second lesson I had, Dom. And the second lesson is I can feel an integrity. Like even though I failed, I can feel an integrity. And what that means for me is I had some opportunities for a short-term win where this thing may have been looked at as a success, whatever it may have been, right? In business and whatever. But when I look at the bigger picture, I feel like this is like every experience that is coming our way is an opportunity to practice, to train ourselves.
Yep.
And when I look back, even if the end feels like a failure, the process and the experience wasn't. And that feels really good. It makes me feel more confident moving forward that I can stay in integrity with myself and how I want to make decisions and how I want to live life. That makes me more excited to go out and do something bigger and bolder.
I think that's really important that you talk about integrity and valuing integrity and playing the long game. So here's the thing, like if outcome and success are the highest priorities, then we see a lot of people who take shortcuts, who do things that are maybe not integrous, maybe things that are downright immoral to cut the corners and get that outcome that they're looking for. And that may work in the short term for the outcome that you're looking for. But in the long run, that shit breaks inevitably, right? Frauds get exposed, relationships feel betrayed. And if you're playing the long game, integrity and alignment are the rising tides that lift all boats. And I remember there's a story that you have from one of like your earlier experiences where when you were trying to invest in real estate and you wanted so badly to make money and you knew inside that like the woman, I guess the real estate agent who would come to you was not to be trusted, but you're like, oh, it sounds so good. So you put money in it and then it was a total disaster. Your money was hung up for a couple of years. You tried to cut the corner and it didn't work out for you.
That all is giving me hives right now. Yes, that's true. that is all true. There's a group called the Institute for the Future. And there's a woman named Kathy Vian, and she's got a great quote that I love when we talk about these sort of things, right? It's like when a large disturbance shakes a complex system, the weakest part of the system collapses first.
Interesting.
So when a large disturbance shakes a complex system, the weakest parts of the system collapse first.
Wow.
And so when I mentioned before about everything being a training for the experience that's next, integrity for me is a really important piece. Because if I'm not training those parts of me now, as things start to get bigger, eventually I'm going to get shook again. Like the system's going to get shook. And if it's not simple and if it's not well honed, it's not in integrity, like it's going to collapse. And so for me, this integrity piece is looking back and saying, hey, I did what I could. Like I did go for it. I did it the right way is really, and it's an important building block for the next endeavors, the next thing I want to get in the arena for.
Well, a quote to punctuate that, I'm going back to Napoleon Hill, is failure cannot cope with persistence. Failure cannot cope with persistence, right? And when you talk about, what's the weakest thing in the system, if the strongest thing in the system is persistence, failure can't cope with that, right? Like it's just over a long enough timeline, enough shots on goal, you'll hit one, right? And he also says, no man ever achieved worthwhile success who did not, at one time or another, find himself with at least one foot hanging well over the brink of failure. Think and Grow Rich. The whole book is about guys who have failed and then found their way back to like massive success.
There is an unbelievable documentary and it's called General Magic. And it's this team of entrepreneurs that got together in 1989. They were a startup. They were led by this guy named Mark Peratt. Mark Peratt was a visionary. He had envisioned like a smartphone. This is back early 80s.
Yep.
And they worked on it. He put this amazing team together, technologists, marketing people, communications, hardware. And they worked and worked and worked. And some of the original investors that are now investors in Apple were put in this also. Coming out of this team, I'm gonna go back to what happened in a moment. But coming out of this team were the inventors of the iPod, the Mac, the iPhone, the Apple Watch, Adobe, right? So this is what this team did
all
in the
Apple,
future. Basically all of Apple.
Yeah.
But what I find really interesting about this team that this guy Mark put together is that even though each of the team members went out and were huge successes by any objective measure, Mark shrank back. And a lot of the team members in the documentary they're like, man, Mark was such a visionary. I don't know where he went. I don't know what he did. Now I looked him up and it looks like he pivoted into some other areas, but not like Apple, iPod, Watch, Adobe, Mac sort of pivot. And so when you talk about, Don, that the persistence is the one thing that failure can't keep up with. Like, dude, I look at this team and I'm like, wow, like these people did these amazing things, but the leader, the visionary, the guy who was bringing this all together really said, no, I'm done with that part of my life.
That's heartbreaking because it feels kind of like you get your hand burned on the stove and then you never cook again, right? And I think a lot of us have been burned from failures that have caused us to shrink in our lives and to never take another big swing again. And while you were talking, I was pulling up the book To Kill a Mockingbird. Elizabeth Gilbert wrote one of our favorite books, Big Magic. She's most well known for Eat, Pray, Love. And in the book, Big Magic, she talks about, and I believe with 95% certainty, and I could have this wrong, but I'm pretty sure, she talked about the author of To Kill a Mockingbird, Harper Lee. To Kill a Mockingbird was the first book written by Harper. And I don't even know if Harper's a man or a woman, because I guess the name could go either way. But let's say it's a he. And there was such success. It was like a meteoric global sensation that Harper Lee was like, how do I follow that up? There's no way I could ever follow that up because my life's work is. And so Harper Lee never wrote another book for the remainder of his life. And I think maybe had a manuscript that he never released while he was alive. And maybe there's like one more book that had come out afterwards, but way after his passing. So he lived a shrunken life. And Elizabeth Gilbert, what's beautiful about her, she wrote her version of To Kill a Mockingbird, and that was called Eat, Pray, Love. Now, that book was a massive global sensation. I think it sold like 15 to 20 million copies, which like just doesn't happen in book sales. And that's it. Like when you write a book like that, basically that is it. You are never going to come to that level of success again. And she was terrified that the next book that she was going to write was going to be a failure. And guess what? It was. She wrote a follow-up to Eat, Pray, Love that was like kind of a sequel to it. No one bought it. It was like panned by critics. She didn't really even like it. And so she got a chance to experience what being beaten down and what failure was like on a really public scale. But Elizabeth Gilbert is like, she is one of the most resilient, she's been to the bottom before. It was actually like the bottom was what caused her to have her Eat, Pray, Love experience and to write about it. So she was no stranger to the bottom. She's like, okay, I'm going to pick myself up again and I'm going to be better for this experience for having had it. And she ended up writing Big Magic after that, which was like one of the creative Bibles for anyone who's an artist or a creator. So, and she's gone on to write like a couple others after that too. And so we can see, man, right? Like the different ways you can either shrink and let your ego get even stronger after failure, or you can allow that moment of failure to shatter your ego so that you can be liberated to be more of who you are.
And just doing some quick fact checking here on the Great Man Within podcast, and Harper Lee, in fact, does go by she. And
she's
now,
a she.
Yeah, you went the wrong way. All right, Dom, what is your second lesson with failure?
Yeah, so my second lesson, I guess, is our fourth and final. Brotherhood allows you to fail bigger. And I mean, we always talk about personal development on your own, slow, shallow, and incomplete. And when I say shallow, when you're on your own, sometimes you won't take as big of a swing because you're afraid. Like when the Mack truck hits you, it's like, who's there to help pick you back up? And I know that for many years of my life, I would take these swings, but they weren't swings for the fences in my life, because if I failed, I was the only one picking myself back up. So brotherhood allows you to fail bigger. And a specific story about that you're privy to is around pursuing a woman that I took a really big swing at, and I struck out. I failed. I'm not going to go into all the details because I'm still, it's kind of something that still belongs in conversations with like my inner circle. But this is a woman she's pretty public in social media. She has an online profile. She's a great creator. And you can really just get a sense of this woman, of who she is. And for the past couple of years, or a couple of years ago, I made a really strong pursuit of this woman. I reached out to her on her different social channels. I even had these grand gestures of women who may have known her to like reach out to her and try to get her attention for me. And the long and the short of it is like, it didn't work. I didn't get her attention. She's in a relationship with another guy. I failed. It was like a really devastating moment for me that, like I went through the whole thing of I'm not good enough. She doesn't want me. Am I ever going to find someone, like who I felt as strongly about as like, excited about as wanting to meet this woman. But when I touched bottom and I tasted that, what I started to notice on the other side was that I never would have even gone for her in the first place if I didn't have my brotherhood. Because when I discovered this woman and her work, I started to feel things that I'd never felt before. And I started to share that with you guys in the men's group. And I was embarrassed. I was sheepish about telling you guys like how excited I am about this woman who I've never met and who doesn't know me. And I'm trying to get her attention. And in the past, previous me would have looked at this woman and been like, that's a fantasy. I would love to have this woman, in another life, but I'm not good enough. I can't, whatever. And I would have settled for something else that would have allowed me to circumvent, quite frankly, the experience that I went through. It was you guys who gave me the confidence to go for it, or to help me find my own confidence. That's probably a better way of saying it. You didn't give me the confidence. You helped me to find my own confidence, and also picked me up when I got shot down. And to be able to pick up from that as a stronger man who now I go for what I want. This is like kind of the icing on the top, the cherry on the cake. Now the idea of going for less than anything that I fully want is like, I'd be an imbecile to do that. It doesn't equate to me anymore to settle, because I've already tasted the worst of what it could be. And I'm like, I got back from that. I got stronger as a result of it. So that's my lesson.
And as one of the guys that you were confiding in, what it did for us is, one, it gave us insight into the type of guy that you are, the things that you're interested in, and certainly something to talk about. But it's also one of the things that I love most about you. And this is how we initially got on this topic, is that you, Dominic, take a lot of swings in life. In social media, on the podcast, in some of your keynotes, we see some of those successes. And that's great. Like, big fans of Dominic, right? But you tell me sometimes, like, I had 5, 10, 15, 20x failures to get to those individual successes. That relationship, that woman being one of those. But being part of that brotherhood, part of that group, created a fan. And we could all collectively go get it. That's amazing. And of course, we were there when it didn't work. So I think that's such a great example of you taking swings and leveling up, right? Letting that ego shatter a little bit, leveling up to a point where now you're like, I'd be an imbecile if I went for anything less than that.
Yeah, it doesn't equate. And for most of my life, I did go for just a little less than I wanted because I would always bypass that failure, right? And so I would win a lot of the games that I played because I was playing smaller games. It's kind of the equivalent of like staying in the minor leagues when I really want to play in the bigs. And I think a lot of men can relate to that. So we see this all the time, Bri, in the masterminds around, brotherhood allowing men to fail bigger. And really, like what we're talking about is like the end game is not about failing bigger. It's about becoming bigger. And the becoming bigger is really about stepping further into your great man, because we all know the definition of hell. It's at the end of your life, the man you became meets the man you could have become. We're all here to become the man that we could have become, like the great man, which is the one who's living his purpose, who goes for 100% of what he wants. So we see the men in our masterminds starting to face things like addiction, starting to go after what they want and leaving the corporate job to start their business, or to find, to start the side hustle. They feel that sense of security of I can fail here, get picked up so I can get back out and, be stronger for another day.
The sweet seduction of safety. It feels so nice until we realize that the sideline, the irrelevance, that not being that great man is actually the worst of it all.
You just reminded me of a quote. There's this song called Closer to Fine. I think it's by the Indigo Girls. And I think the line is, I sailed my ship of safety until I sank it. I sailed my ship of safety till I sank it. And you know what I mean? Like this goes back to what you were saying before about it feels safer to be irrelevant than it does to fail, when we all know that that's not in the long run. So let us summarize our key points. Your 2 lessons learned from failure are?
Number 1 is I can come back. I can come back from whatever that failure, the symptoms of that were. And number 2 is I can move forward bigger and faster if I'm moving with integrity.
Beautiful. And my 2 are failure will either strengthen or shatter your ego. And which one happens depends on whether you believe in the fixed or growth mindset. And no matter what happens in life, I'm better for having had the experience is the ultimate growth mindset perspective. And the second insight is brotherhood allows you to fail bigger. Hey, if you enjoyed this conversation that Brian and I just had about the lessons we've learned from failing and failing big in life, and if you're listening to this episode on Spotify, will you take 5 seconds to go to the main Great Man Within page and leave us a 5-star rating? That's all it takes. You have to go to the Great Man Within main page on Spotify. There's a rating system right there. If you give us 5 stars, it would mean the world to us. Thank you.